and in particular this NAMA on self-supply renewable energy systems in Chile. Um, I wasn't sure about the level of knowledge that everybody has on NAMAs on the topic, and I assume that some of you might already know quite a bit, but that there are others that are not that familiar with NAMAs. So I will start this session by just giving you like an overview, whistle-stop tour on NAMAs to explain a little bit what the context is, where they came from, and what the current status is with NAMAs. Apologies to those who already know this, and then we'll take a closer look at this particular case study, this particular NAMA in Chile, and then I think we'll have sufficient time for any questions that you may have. So sorry, this was the outline that I just mentioned. But before kind of going into NAMAs, I always think it's quite good to remind ourselves why we're actually talking about this and what the backdrop is. I'm sure you're also quite familiar with these types of graphs, which show different emissions pathways to 2050. And we can see here the top line, the black line, that's our business as usual pathway, which will kind of mean a temperature increase that is quite significant, as you can see on the temperature scale there. Then below that, in sort of red color, I think it is, there's the pathway, which is the emissions path that we will go in if all countries actually achieve the pledges that they put on the table. This will currently, if all pledges are actually achieved, this will mean that we're heading into a world where we're above 3 degrees warmer. What that means in turn, you can see on the right-hand side, where you have all different impacts on our ecosystems and ultimately on our societies. Where we really want to be are the two bottom graphs. The purple one is the pathway which would lead to 2-degree warming, which is in line what science actually recommends. And then the bottom one would be the ideal scenario that is at this stage, I think, unattainable, which would be 1.5 degree pathway. So what we're talking about really is trying to push the two bottom lines down to the two top lines, other way around, the two top lines down to the two bottom lines. And this is really where NAMAs come in. So hopefully with NAMAs, we can make some kind of contribution so that we can actually achieve the 2-degree emissions pathway. So this was the backdrop. Then where did it all start with NAMAs? NAMAs came out of the climate change negotiations. They were first mentioned in 2007, actually, in the Bali Action Plan, where for the first time developing countries actually agreed to undertake mitigation actions provided in the context of sustainable development, provided that they receive support from developed countries. And since kind of the Bali Action Plan, at the various subsequent conferences of the parties, different, the modalities around NAMAs were discussed. But essentially, kind of the definition of NAMAs hasn't changed much since this 2007 statement. What is an important development to note is that since the last conference in Warsaw last December, the NAMA registry is fully operational under the UNFCCC auspices, and this registry is really sort of like a NAMA clearinghouse, which allows countries to submit NAMA proposals on the one hand to obtain support for their implementation, and on the other hand for funding for NAMA funders or potential NAMA funders to provide information on available support. So it's kind of meant as a matchmaking facility. Now, what are key aspects of a NAMA? I think it is important to note that a NAMA is voluntary. It's a voluntary intervention typically by a developing country government. It is in line with national or local development priorities. I think this is also an important feature to recognize. Development objectives are typically even the starting point for NAMAs. Mitigation in some instances can become sort of the co-benefit of it. So it is development has a very high emphasis in NAMAs. NAMAs can be supported either by domestic sources, in this case they are referred to as unilateral NAMAs, or by international sources, which are then what is referred to supported NAMAs, which is kind of what we're talking about really here. Of course, they're meant to reduce GHG emissions, and also quite importantly, they're meant to be measurable, reportable, and verifiable, so in short, MRV-able. To ensure transparency in this aspect is particularly important for many of the funders or potential funders of NAMAs. Now, beyond kind of these very general characteristics of NAMAs and this very kind of general definition, so to speak, of NAMAs in the actual negotiating text, there are no detailed definitions. And effectively, what has happened is that NAMAs are being defined through kind of learning by doing, through actions on the ground. And in the last kind of in the recent, with this experience, kind of three or various types of NAMAs are beginning to crystallize. So at the kind of very kind of top level, you would have strategy NAMA. So these could be, for instance, renewable energy strategy. That could be a NAMA. Then you have policies and programs, which are government-led measures, and it could be like a feed-in tariff, an energy-efficient lighting program. Or you could also have specific projects that could be NAMAs. So effectively anything that reduces GHG emissions is and can be a NAMA. Having said that, the emphasis is, as activities show, is clearly more on policies and on activities that have kind of longer-term transformational impact, so beyond just individual mitigation projects. I think it's also quite interesting always to look at the differences of NAMAs to the CDM. As a lot of people are familiar with the Clean Development Mechanism, it's one of the other mechanisms that came out of the international climate negotiations to support mitigation actions in developing countries. But the two mechanisms are essentially quite different. And here this tries to kind of draw out the key differences. On the one hand, in terms of activity, I already mentioned that for NAMAs you can have a very wide range of activities that can be NAMAs. Anything, as I said, that reduces emissions theoretically can be a NAMA, whereas in the CDM it is individual projects, or as in the program of activities, you have like an aggregation of individual projects. Then very importantly, in NAMAs, the funds flow to the government and not to the project developer, which in the CDM in many cases is the private sector. Also with NAMAs, the key drivers behind NAMAs are governments. They can be typically national governments, potentially also local government, but it is really a government-led process. Can they generate carbon credits? CDM, of course, yes, because that's the finance mechanism of the CDM. NAMAs, I put a very clear no here, which is maybe a no with a question mark. There are kind of credited NAMAs is a term that is also being discussed, but at this point in time, it is not clear if and when and how NAMAs can or will generate carbon credits. And then, as I mentioned before, sustainable development, which was kind of a feature of the CDM, but not very prominently, is quite a core element of any NAMA and a core driver behind many NAMAs that we see. Now, what's the current state of play with NAMAs? I just wanted to share some statistics with you that we draw from two main sources. One is a NAMA database that we kind of maintain at ECOFIS, where we try to track NAMA activities around the world, and where we currently have 87 NAMAs and 37 feasibility studies from 35 countries. And then also drawing from, we also draw information from the UNFCCC NAMA registry, which is of course the more formal platform for NAMAs, where you currently have 40 submissions by countries. 36 are for supported NAMAs and for unilateral NAMAs. And this is kind of the overall statistic you can see here. And if we try to distribute that or divide it by actual stage of development, and you can see here that the vast majority of the NAMA activities are still what we refer to as concepts, so they're not kind of fully implementable proposals as yet. There are few very detailed proposals around and very few NAMAs actually in implementation. Now, it's also important to note this is just the picture that we get on NAMAs that are actually where you have publicly available documentation. There are a lot more NAMA activities going on, which cannot be captured here through either the registry or the database. But activity has really picked up quite a bit in the recent years. Now, when we look at the regional distribution of NAMAs, this is also quite interesting. And the comparison here to the CDM, you can see that with NAMAs, it is Latin America that has been leading the way actually with NAMAs and is still the most active region, followed by Africa and then Asia. In the CDM, it was really Asia Pacific that was dominating. And so you can see that NAMAs really have a wider regional spread. And interesting also, Africa has quite a strong representation and also least developed countries. And possible reasons for that, but that's just an interpretation, is that NAMAs provide more flexibility in the design, and because of their emphasis on sustainable development, which is important in particular for least developed countries. Now, when we look at the sectoral distribution, you can also see that whilst energy supply is the strongest in NAMAs and is also the strongest in CDM, NAMAs also have a much wider spread across the different sectors. And interestingly, also sectors that were underrepresented in the CDM, such as transport and buildings, so building energy efficiency, are quite prominent in NAMAs. And again, the reasons for that are that under NAMAs, again, they're much more flexible as an instrument. MRV requirements are much less stringent, and because they allow you to also account for longer-term and indirect emissions reductions and also sustainable development benefits. And lastly, this is just to close kind of the general kind of tour of NAMAs. This is kind of one of the most important topics, that's the finance. Now, where will the money actually come from? Who will pay for NAMAs, and how will this money be channeled? Yeah, this is, I think, still the key question, and of course, kind of one of the key topics also under the climate negotiations. Well, you know that new and additional funds for climate change have been agreed by developed countries. They provided 30 billion fast start finance up until 2012, which was, according to most statistics, actually met. But they also promised to mobilize 100 billion per annum by 2020. And the Green Climate Fund has been set up, but it is still empty. It's still not clear how much money will actually go into the fund and how this finance will be distributed. It will be distributed between mitigation and adaptation. That is clear, and some of that will probably be channeled to NAMAs. But yeah, how much and if and when, that is a question mark. And a few NAMAs, as I showed earlier, are in implementation. Finance so far has focused mainly on readiness activities, so preparing countries for NAMAs, capacity building, supporting development of concepts and proposals. And well, since last year, there's one dedicated finance facility for NAMAs available, and that's the British-German NAMA facility, which will now fund the implementation of 5 NAMAs, and this Chile self-supply renewable energy NAMA is one of them. But yeah, it's clear that more commitment to finance is needed, and we need to see actually finance flow into mitigation to also build confidence in this new mechanism. What we also know is that public finance resources are going to be rather limited, and that any public finance will have to be used really wisely to leverage private investment. So the private sector is expected to play a very significant role in all this. And I think particularly the last point is something that is very important to keep in mind when designing NAMAs or when preparing NAMAs, is really to figure out how can I use public support in the most effective way to enable private sector investments. Now, this was kind of the overview introduction of NAMAs. I will now move on to our particular case study, the Chile self-supply renewable energy NAMA. And this NAMA, as Fernando mentioned in the introduction, we supported the development of this NAMA proposal under a project called Mitigation Momentum. Under this project, we collaborate with ECN, the Energy Research Center of the Netherlands, and we support NAMA activities in 5 countries, apart from Chile, also in Peru and Tunisia, Kenya, and Indonesia. The project itself is funded by the International Climate Initiative of the German government, and in Chile itself, we worked closely with the Ministry of Environment, which is kind of the at the government level coordinating all NAMA activities in Chile, and then with the Ministry of Energy, of course, as the NAMA is in the energy sector. But most closely, we worked with the Centro de Energías Renovables, the Center for Renewable Energy, which is an agency of the Ministry of Energy that promotes renewable energy in Chile. And our local partner in Chile was Fundación Chile. Now, just to give a little bit of context to the energy situation in Chile, you can see here on this graph that, as is the case with many developing countries that have strong economic growth, that energy demand, electricity consumption is projected to increase quite significantly in the next years. And you can see here the 2 main grid systems, the central grid and the northern grid. And by 2020, it is estimated that an additional 8,000 megawatt of new capacity will be needed to satisfy demand. At the same time, it is important to note that Chile relies quite heavily on hydropower, in particular the central grid, and has almost no indigenous fossil energy resources. Now, kind of given droughts and other environmental concerns, the development of additional hydro capacity is difficult, and there's also concern over gas supplies, especially competitively priced gas supplies. So as a result of that, most of the new, or around half of the new generation capacity that is currently under construction is actually coal. Well, in recognition of these challenges in the energy sector, but also in recognition of the huge renewable energy potential that Chile actually has, in particular the solar potential, the government launched the National Energy Strategy in 2012 and put a strong emphasis on the development of what is termed non-conventional renewable energy sources. There is a target in place of 10% of renewable energy by 2024, which is kind of implemented through a supplier obligation. And there's also the Renewable Energy Center, which was set up to promote renewable energy throughout the country. Currently, there's a tender process in place for kind of the larger scale grid-connected renewable energy projects, but there's no kind of comprehensive package of initiatives as yet for the smaller scale or medium scale renewable energy projects, so kind of the self-supply side of things. And this is precisely where this NAMA comes in. So our NAMA has as an objective to promote the incorporation of renewable energy systems for self-supply. And self-supply is defined as long it's self-supply if at least 50% of the energy that is generated is actually consumed on site. In case of electricity, the remainder can be fed into the grid. It is targeted at mainly industry, the agro-industry, so livestock, dairy, food, wine, but also retail and tourism. And any non-conventional renewable energy technology can qualify. But I mean, focus is expected to be on biogas, biomass, the solar technologies, small wind, geothermal, and potentially also mini hydro. Now, the starting point when kind of developing the NAMA proposal, and that is really the starting point for developing any NAMA proposal, is to look at the barriers. Why are no investments in these technologies happening? And we actually, together with our local partners, we did quite some extensive research into these specific barriers, and we spoke to various stakeholders, the private sector, to companies who had some experience with these technologies, etc. And we found that there are quite a wide range of different barriers. Of course, financial barriers always come up, so payback periods for renewable energy systems are not as good versus other kind of business investments, so there are opportunity costs involved. Often it is difficult to actually get finance for these kinds of projects because the banks are not familiar with these technologies and they see them as high risk. There's also, to some extent, an unwillingness to invest in pre-feasibility studies by the actual kind of companies or investors because the outcomes are uncertain. But then apart from the financial barriers, what we actually found in the study was that capacity and awareness barriers were equally high, if not higher. So there was kind of a lack, or there is a lack of access to qualified installers and consulting companies who can actually deliver projects throughout the country. And not only perhaps in the urban centers, equally qualified technicians to then operate and maintain the systems. There's generally a lack of understanding and a lack of trust in these technologies because there are not very many examples around that one could look at to see how these technologies actually work in practice. And then by some, there was also mention of certain regulatory barriers, especially for smaller, medium-scale projects to connect to the grid. But these kind of in the context of self-supply are somewhat less of an issue. So based on this barrier analysis, we then kind of designed the NAMA. So the NAMA kind of itself has various components, and each of the components is meant to kind of address and remove, hopefully, the barrier that was identified earlier. At the heart of the NAMA is really a financial component, and this kind of comes in at two stages of the project cycle. First of all, there will be a kind of a pre-investment grant provided to undertake pre-feasibility studies that was identified as a specific barrier. And then secondly, at the investment stage, to provide incentives or to support the actual investment in the technologies through a soft loan scheme and also a grant scheme for certain technologies. And coupled with this financial component, we also kind of designed technical support program and an outreach component to address the significant barriers in terms of capacity, in terms of actually understanding the technologies, in terms of providing pilot studies and showcasing the technologies to make them more tangible and generally kind of boost the renewable energy sector in the country. Now, I just wanted to look at the financial component in a little bit more detail because I think that is what is at the heart of the NAMA, and to some extent also I think what convinced the NAMA funders to actually step in and support this NAMA. And kind of the design of this financial component, the objective of it is, of course, always to find kind of what is the right level of incentive, that you need, looking at it from the perspective of the investor, so to improve the payback conditions to a level that the actual investment decision is actually made, but also balance, on the other hand, the perspective of the program, where you, of course, want to maximize your funds to achieve greatest impact, and to be able to support the greatest number of projects. And one of the things that we looked at is the levelized cost of energy of different technologies, and this is quite a crude view of reality. And in reality, the cost ranges are a lot, are quite large, depending on the specific characteristics and the circumstances. But nevertheless, kind of this kind of analysis gives you some idea of the relative competitiveness of different technologies. And we can see here that, for example, mini hydro and also biogas technologies are already. This is the retail electricity price in Chile. That these two technologies are already cost competitive, so arguably an additional incentive is not really necessary, whereas other technologies, such as in particular solar technologies, are not cost competitive as yet, and will need some form of incentive to make them competitive. So kind of this is kind of one of the analysis that we undertook, and this is the view of the financial component, which looks a bit overwhelming now perhaps, but you can see here on the top, this is where the international NAMA finance would come in, and on the one hand you would have a grant, the NAMA grant fund, which would fund these pre-feasibility studies and also a grant scheme for certain technologies. The whole fund or the whole program will be administered by the Center for Renewable Energy, which sits at the heart of this. And then, of course, investment grants provided to the end user. There will be some kind of technical warranty guarantee to make sure that the quality is right. And then, on the other hand, you have the NAMA Guarantee Fund, and this guarantee fund will basically allow other funders, such as the National Development Bank and International Development Banks, as well as commercial finance institutions, to contribute senior debt. And then project loans would actually be administered through the commercial banks, either through ESCOs to the end user or directly to the end user. And I think it's maybe a bit clearer. This is kind of an example calculation, how this is all kind of set up. So you would have, as an example, the NAMA Grant Guarantee Fund, which is what the Chilean government asked the NAMA facility to support, would provide $10 million solely to provide guarantees. With the availability of these guarantees, the international development banks would then put up $50 million available as loans. Commercial financial institutions would put in $30 million. So you would have a total of $80 million of loan funds available. And these would be these individual loans, so companies could apply for these loans, would finance up to 80% of the investment costs. So companies would be asked to provide 20% in equity. And the interest rate in this example, that's how we calculated it, is 3.75% over 15 years. So this should be quite attractive. And kind of the nice setup with this is that actually the international finance that is needed, so the public finance element of 10 million would actually leverage an investment of altogether 100 million. So this is what I mentioned earlier, kind of a setup where you use limited public funds to then actually kind of set private sector investment in motion. And now just briefly on the expected impacts of the NAMA. Of course, the NAMA is expected to reduce GHG emissions theoretically of as much as 1.7 million tons of CO2. But also kind of the ambition of the NAMA is really to shift the market quite significantly towards renewable energy, so to create jobs and really to provide a boost to the renewable energy technology and services sector in Chile, which will then also kind of have an effect on other renewable energy projects and project finance, etc., in the future. And the outlook on next steps, as I said, last year there was the first call by the British-German NAMA facility to actually finance implementation of NAMAs as the first dedicated fund for this. And the Chilean government successfully applied with this NAMA and was one of 5 countries or 5 NAMAs that actually received support alongside Costa Rica, Mexico, Colombia, and Indonesia. Implementation is expected to begin later this year. And I think we're all, at least in the NAMA world, looking forward to seeing how this implementation progresses as an example of one of the first supported NAMAs that is moving in this direction. And then lastly, just to close on some kind of observations or lessons learned in this process, what we think made this NAMA a success. I think first and foremost, I think it is government ownership and support, which was very strong in the case of Chile, evidence throughout also the whole project, the interactions between government and with government, as well as actual financial support that will be provided by the Chilean government to this NAMA. It is very important that the NAMA is in line with national strategies and national priorities, that it kind of sits within a wider, longer-term national development objectives also. Very important is, I think, a stakeholder-based approach to NAMA design. So throughout the project, we try to speak to the different actors. We involved private sector. We spoke to the nascent ESCO market in Chile, of course, to government, etc., and really made sure that we address all the concerns and all the barriers and that they're properly reflected in the design of the NAMA. The barrier analysis. No, this is really, at the heart of it, to really understand why are things not happening, why are investments not flowing to mitigation as we would like, and then really design kind of a mix of interventions, financial, technical support, awareness, regulatory, whatever it might be, to really kind of have a package to address the barriers together. Because even if you remove one barrier and the others are not addressed, you're not actually getting anywhere. We also engaged with the finance sector, so with the national banks, with Corfo, in the case of Chile, but also commercial banks as well as international funders quite early on in the process to make sure that the finance mechanism is designed in a way that it's realistic and that it actually flies. And then lastly, I think since we're in early days with NAMAs also, I think it was ultimately also a success because it's very concrete, it's realistic, it's implementable, and it was kind of developed to a level of detail that it was actually tangible also for funders to understand where this is going and to see that implementation, that it is implementation ready and also realistic to implement. And with that I close. Thank you for your attention so far. I'd be happy to respond to any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you very much, Frauke. So we will go now for a few questions from the audience. So please feel free to go ahead with your questions, please. So we will allow a few moments to audience to submit the various questions. So we have a first question from Glycon Garcia. What's the recommended approach to get support from governments for NAMA projects? Thank you.
Can I just ask to get support from the national government? Is that what is meant, or in the national context?
Yeah, it seems whether something can be made to further engage governments to adopt these NAMA schemes.
Yeah, and I think on the national government level, so looking at developing countries, I think if you're looking as a private sector organization or research or any organization into NAMAs, I think it is important to engage with the national government that is actually kind of the focal point for NAMAs, and because and kind of has the linkages on the international level, also on the policy level, to ensure that there is government commitment and some kind of coordinated approach. And then at the international level, I think from the funding perspective, it is seeing more fundable, kind of detailed and good proposals out there.
Okay, thank you. So there is another question. So what are the incentives for ESCOs and private developers to undertake NAMA projects?
Well, I mean, I think, I mean, it kind of goes to this question of who's actually driving NAMAs and the development of NAMAs. And as I mentioned, NAMAs are really driven by governments. So they're often policy related. And the incentive, I think, for private sector or ESCOs is I think, to engage with the respective national government to make sure that policy is developed in a way that is conducive to investment. And I think the process for engagement is really at this NAMA design stage through these stakeholder processes, and to make sure that that kind of the concerns are heard at the government level.
Okay, good. What is the connection between release of NAMA funds and the MRV accomplishment? MRV guarantee the effectivity of the process? Is a third party who is in charge of monitoring of MRV?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's a very, very important question. This whole, the topic of MRV. There are no kind of detailed guidelines on the MRV of NAMAs. They're very kind of general guidelines at the kind of international level, but just to say that MRV is important and that NAMA, the impacts of NAMAs will be reported through the national processes. But there are no strict methodologies or guidelines in place as we've seen, for example, for the CDM. So there's also kind of no requirement to have some form of third-party verification of the MRV process. Having said that, I mean, for funders, it is very important to see, of course, what the impact of their funding is. So they do very much stress stress MRV as an important factor also when selecting NAMAs. But within that, I think it's you have quite a lot of flexibility to say what you MRV and how you MRV it. And I think what we're seeing right at this moment, in the absence of any kind of guidelines or agreed standards or anything like that, it tends to be kind of a bilateral process. Now, if you have a NAMA supporter, a funder that is interested in supporting your NAMA, then you engage kind of in this bilateral negotiation or discussion to see, okay, what is it that I can deliver, what is it that you need in order to satisfy your systems, so to speak. Hello?
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
No,
Sorry, I was muted. So yeah, next question. I will read. From your point of view, what are the key differences between NAMAs and low emission development strategies? Thank you.
The key difference, from my point of view, is that low emissions development strategies really provide like an overarching framework for NAMA. So that is kind of the overarching strategic approach, and then NAMAs, so to speak, would kind of flow out of that as actions that would implement your strategy. So in an ideal world, a country would set up a low emissions development strategy first and develop that to some level of detail, and then would identify the individual actions, so the NAMAs, to implement the strategy. In reality, these things, of course, happen somewhat in parallel, that NAMAs are developed first and then inform the strategy, and vice versa.
Okay. Thank you. The main policy aspect I can see is the 50% on-site use. Is decentralization of the sector the main objective of the government?
I'm probably not in the best position to respond to this. I think the Ministry of Energy and Environment would have a firmer view on this. No, this is not the main objective of the government. I wouldn't say that. I mean, it's in the case of Chile, there is like a tender scheme in place at the moment for kind of the larger scale grid connected renewable energy projects. And there was a gap basically to support kind of the smaller, medium-scale renewable energy projects for self-supply, and the recognition that there are simply a lot of opportunities out there in the different sectors, and potentially also given kind of the particular geographical challenges that Chile has with kind of some very remote areas as well. But I wouldn't say that is a particular objective.
Okay. Next question, how to avoid the double counting of the GHG offset?
Yes, I mean, this is kind of goes to the question of NAMAs and crediting, and the generation of carbon credits with NAMAs. Right at the moment, the NAMA activities that we're seeing, and also this includes the self-supply renewable energy NAMA, is not set up for offsetting. So the finance will flow from international governments to Chile, and there is no kind of payback in that sense on their side. So you don't enter in this situation that you have double counting. But this is something that we still need to see how this will evolve, how NAMAs will evolve alongside, let's say, sectoral mechanisms like the new market mechanisms, and how this issue will be dealt with. But it's not, at the moment, it's not an issue as such.
Okay, good. Could you please shed a little bit light on TNA connection with NAMAs?
So yeah, I mean, TNA, the technology needs assessments. Yeah, interesting point. I think officially, I mean, there is no real connection. I mean, there is no kind of connection. These kind of things happen somewhat in parallel, although they should be more structurally connected, I think. But I think that is one of the areas. With NAMAs, it's also kind of an evolution, no? And it's a process, and I think everybody is kind of learning how this mechanism will kind of evolve, and also in relation to all these other initiatives or mechanisms that are out there. But I think there's certainly some room for improvement for connecting TNAs and NAMAs better. Hello?
Yeah, so, sorry, next question. In this NAMA case, Fundación Chile is the local partner. Would it be possible that Fundación Chile runs an additional NAMA project, for example, in the energy efficiency field? Thank you.
Well, Fundación Chile was a partner that we as Ecofis chose to work with us under this project. So kind of, we work together alongside kind of the Center for Renewable Energy as kind of the official counterpart. So they kind of acted basically as consultants, but not the lead for the NAMA is with the Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Energy. So I would say they would be your main contact point to see what the opportunities might be to develop an energy efficiency NAMA.
Okay. So next question. There is any research development recently in identifying emerging countries' technology needs?
I have to admit I'm not fully following the kind of technology needs assessment processes and what the latest status is. I know that, and you probably know that too, various countries have undergone kind of this TNA process, but I'm personally not aware of kind of more recent research specifically in emerging economies.
Okay. Would you propose a similar NAMA methodology for Nigeria?
Yes, I mean the methodology is always kind of the same. So the process of developing a NAMA, looking at what is already happening in the sector, bringing in your stakeholders, doing a detailed barrier analysis, and then designing kind of the NAMA interventions on that basis. So kind of the process would be the same, but then of course it depends on the national circumstances, the structure of the sector, what the specific barriers are in Nigeria, let's say in the renewable energy sector, and then to make sure that that the measures you take, that the interventions, that the actions are bespoke, are actually addressing the specific issues that the country has. But the process and methodology would be similar, yes.
Okay. The NAMA sponsors are not using the NAMA as GHG obligation, such as UK or Germany governments, vis-à-vis their commitment with the EU?
No, they're not. I mean, that is one of the key differences of NAMAs to CDM. NAMAs were not conceived as an offsetting mechanism, but really they come from the perspective of the developing country, where developing countries actually said, we will undertake mitigation actions ourselves, but we need help with that. We need support. But it wasn't meant as an offsetting. And really the motivation for the UK or Germany or other governments to provide finance is really under the obligations that these countries have under the climate negotiations. So the commitment that these countries made to provide support and to provide finance for mitigation.
Okay, thank you. Next question, would you introduce shortly any existing projects in Indonesia?
Indonesia is one of the very active countries on NAMAs in Asia, arguably the most active in Asia, I think. And they have one NAMA project which is the most advanced and which also received funding under the NAMA facility, which is in transportation, urban transportation. But I know under our project, the Mitigation Momentum projects, we're currently developing a NAMA also in the renewable energy sector, also for self-supply. So those are the two concrete ones I'm aware of. But Indonesia, they also have a national focal point and are approaching the whole topic of NAMAs quite proactively and are very engaged.
Okay, thank you. So next question. Yeah. So is there any contact point within the Argentina, Brazilian, or Mexican governments for NAMA projects? Thank you.
I think in those three countries, I think the starting point or your best starting point is probably the Ministry of Environment. That's typically where the ownership is located within government, or also the focal point for the CDM, for example. I know that Mexico, they do have a NAMA office, which is located in the Ministry of Environment. In the case of Argentina, it would be the Environmental Secretariat. In the case of Brazil, I'm not sure, but I would also imagine that it's the Ministry of Environment would be the first port of call for that.
Okay, thank you very much. So I believe there are no more remaining questions. So thank you very much, Frauke, for this very interesting session today. Thank you to our audience for attending and submitting such interesting questions as well. And now, Frauke, I give you the floor to close the session.
Yeah, well, thank you, Fernando, for moderating the sessions and for providing this opportunity. And yeah, thanks all for attending and for your interesting questions. Yeah, if you have any further comments or questions, you can see my email there. I'm happy to respond to any of these bilaterally as well. And yeah, I do hope you found this useful. And yeah, have a nice day. Thanks.